The storm arrived over Austin with the kind of violence that made glass shiver in its frames. Rain hammering the emergency room windows in sheets so thick they turned the city into a watercolor smear of red taillights and neon pharmacy signs. Inside the ER, the air tasted metallic and electric, a blend of antiseptic, ozone from the storm, and the faint copper tang of blood that never quite left the trauma bay, no matter how many times the floors were scrubbed. Marla Reyes moved through the chaos with the economy of someone who had learned to make every step count. Her navy scrubs still crisp, despite the 12-hour shift already behind her, her dark hair pulled back so tightly it made her temples ache. She was 29 years old and had been a nurse for 6 years, long enough to know the difference between urgency and panic, long enough to trust her instincts when they whispered warnings in the spaces between heartbeats. Tonight, those instincts were screaming, a cold finger of dread tracing down her spine as she prepared the medication tray for the incoming trauma case. Her hands steady, even as her mind raced through the protocols she had memorized until they became muscle memory. The patient was 14 years old, the son of Governor Mercer, a detail that had transformed the usual controlled chaos of the ER into something sharper and more dangerous, something that made every staff member move with the awareness that their actions tonight would be scrutinized, dissected, possibly weaponized. Daniel Mercer had been in a car accident on the rain-slicked highway, his father's armored SUV hydroplaning into a concrete barrier with enough force to crack ribs and puncture a lung. And now he was being rushed into Trauma Bay 3 with an entourage that included 2 state troopers, a press liaison, and the governor himself, whose face was a mask of barely controlled terror that made him look older than his 53 years. Marla had glimpsed him through the glass partition, his expensive suit rumpled and rain-soaked, his hands pressed against the observation window as if he could will his son back to safety through sheer paternal desperation. She understood that kind of fear, had seen it countless times in the faces of parents who suddenly realized that money and power meant nothing against the fragility of human tissue, the randomness of metal and velocity, and bad timing. Dr. Conrad Hale swept into the trauma bay with the theatrical confidence of someone who had been celebrated so many times he had forgotten how to doubt himself. His silver-threaded hair still perfectly styled despite the storm, his surgical gloves snapping into place with practiced precision. He was 48 years old and had the kind of reputation that preceded him like a herald announcing royalty. The surgeon who had saved a senator's life during a campaign rally shooting, the trauma specialist who had been featured in medical journals and cable news segments, the man whose TED Talk about crisis decision-making had been viewed 2 million times. Marla had worked with him before, had witnessed his skill firsthand, the way his hands could move through torn flesh and shattered bone with an artist's precision. But she had also witnessed his arrogance, the way he treated nurses like interchangeable cogs in his personal machine of excellence, the way he dismissed questions or concerns with a raised eyebrow that made you feel small for having asked. Tonight, he was operating with the additional pressure of knowing that failure would not be buried in medical records or internal reviews, but splashed across headlines. His name forever linked to the governor's tragedy. Marla double-checked the medication vials lined up on the stainless steel tray, her eyes scanning the labels with the methodical care of someone who knew that a single misread number could mean the difference between healing and harm. The epinephrine syringe caught her attention, its clear liquid innocent-looking in the harsh fluorescent light, but the dosage printed on the label made her pause, made her pulse quicken with the kind of alarm that came from pattern recognition honed through years of catching errors before they became disasters. The concentration was wrong, 10 times higher than what the protocol called for, a dosage that would send a young heart into arrhythmia. that would flood his system with adrenaline until his vessels constricted and his organs screamed for oxygen they could not receive. She picked up the syringe, turning it in her gloved hand, reading the label again to be certain. Her mind already running through the chain of how this mistake had happened, a pharmacy error, a mislabeled stock, a moment of distraction in the controlled chaos of preparing for a high-profile case. It did not matter how the error occurred. What mattered was stopping it before it reached the patient, before it became irreversible. She approached Dr. Hale as he was reviewing the chest X-ray clipped to the light board. His eyes narrowed in concentration. His jaw set in that familiar expression of controlled intensity that made residents nervous and medical students awestruck. Marla cleared her throat, keeping her voice professional and steady, despite the adrenaline now coursing through her own veins, despite the awareness that she was about to challenge someone whose ego filled the room like a physical presence. She held up the syringe, angling it so he could see the label clearly, her words chosen carefully to convey urgency without accusation, to present the information as fact rather than judgment. She explained the dosage discrepancy, pointed out the concentration mismatch, suggested that they pause to verify the medication before administration, her tone respectful but firm, the tone of someone who understood hierarchy but refused to let it override patient safety. Dr. Hale glanced at the syringe, his expression flickering from concentration to irritation so quickly that anyone not watching closely might have missed it. And then he did something that would haunt him for the rest of his career. He dismissed her with a sharp, cutting sentence that landed between them like a blade. "I know what I'm doing." The words were not shouted or aggressive, but delivered with the kind of icy confidence that was meant to end the conversation, to remind her of the gulf between his years of surgical training and her nursing degree, to reassert the hierarchy that had been momentarily questioned. He turned back to the X-ray without waiting for her response, his body language broadcasting dismissal, his attention already shifting back to the procedure that awaited. The incision he would make, the life he would save with the skill that had made him legendary. Marla stood there for 3 seconds that felt like 3 hours, the syringe still in her hand, her heart hammering against her ribs as she made a split-second calculation that every nurse learns to make. Push back and risk being labeled difficult, or step aside and trust that someone with more authority knows better. The room hummed with activity around her, monitors beeping their electronic reassurances, other staff members moving with choreographed efficiency, the governor's face still pressed against the glass like a ghost watching his own future unfold. She placed the syringe back on the tray with hands that wanted to shake but refused to, and she stepped back into her assigned position, her mind screaming even as her body complied with the unspoken rules of institutional hierarchy. Uday Daniel Mercer lay on the trauma table with the terrible stillness of someone whose body had decided that survival required absolute conservation of energy, his chest rising and falling in shallow breaths that made the monitors register each struggle with ascending numbers and descending lines. His face was pale beneath the oxygen mask, bruises already blooming purple across his left cheekbone where the airbag had struck him. His eyes closed against the harsh lights and the chaos of adults moving around him with urgent purpose. He was 14 years old, a sophomore at a private academy where he had been learning Latin and calculus, and where his biggest concerns until tonight had been finishing his history paper and asking out the girl who sat 2 rows ahead of him in English class. Now he was stripped to his waist, electrodes stuck to his chest like mechanical leeches, IV lines snaking into his arms with their lifelines of saline and medication. His dignity sacrificed to the emergency that had transformed him from governor's son to trauma patient in the span of a single hydroplaning skid. Dr. Hale worked with the focused intensity of someone who had trained his mind to exclude everything except the task before him. his hands moving through the established protocols with mechanical precision, his voice calling out instructions that were answered immediately by the surgical team who orbited him like planets around a sun. He examined the chest tube placement, checked the oxygen saturation readings, palpated the abdomen for internal bleeding with fingers that could detect abnormalities through skin and muscle, his brain processing information faster than most people could observe it. This was what he was made for, these moments of controlled crisis where his training transformed chaos into choreography, where his decisions meant life rather than statistics, where he became more than a man and closer to a myth. The epinephrine injection was next in the protocol, necessary to stabilize blood pressure before the surgical repair of the pneumothorax. Routine enough that he barely thought about it as he reached for the prepared syringe on the medication tray. Marla watched from her position at the monitors, her eyes tracking every movement with the hypervigilance of someone who knows something is wrong, but has been silenced by systems and status. She had documented her warning in her mental ledger, had done what the protocols required by speaking up, but now she was trapped in the terrible space of watching disaster approach in slow motion while being powerless to prevent it. Her hands gripped the edge of the monitoring station until her knuckles went white, her breathing shallow as she willed Dr. Hale to pause, to double-check, to give her one more opportunity to prevent what was about to happen. Around her, the trauma bay pulsed with activity, a respiratory therapist adjusting the oxygen flow, a radiology tech positioning the portable X-ray machine, another nurse preparing surgical instruments with the metallic clink of steel on steel. But none of them knew what she knew. None of them had seen the label that had made her blood run cold with recognition. The syringe looked innocent in Dr. Hale's gloved hand, just clear liquid in plastic and glass, but Marla could see it for what it was. A loaded weapon pointed at a child's heart, a mistake dressed up in medical packaging. 10 times the concentration it should have been, and about to flood a young body with chemical chaos. She opened her mouth to speak again, her professional training warring with the institutional conditioning that taught nurses to defer, to trust, to believe that doctors knew better because they had more degrees and more authority and more years of being told they were exceptional. Her vocal cords tightened, the words forming on her tongue, a second warning rising up through years of learned silence. But before she could give them voice, Dr. Hale had already depressed the plunger, the clear liquid flowing through the IV line with the same innocent appearance as saline, disappearing into Daniel Mercer's bloodstream, where it would begin its work of destruction within seconds. The room continued its controlled chaos for exactly 12 seconds after the injection, long enough for Dr. Hale to step back from the table and begin dictating his notes, long enough for the respiratory therapist to confirm ventilation rates, long enough for the world to still believe that everything was proceeding according to plan. Then the monitors erupted into a symphony of alarm, every machine suddenly screaming its electronic warnings in overlapping pitches that made the air itself feel dangerous, made every medical professional in the room snap to attention with the instantaneous recognition of crisis escalating beyond control. Daniel's heart rate spiked to 190 beats per minute, the numbers climbing on the display screen like a rocket ascending into dangerous atmosphere, his blood pressure simultaneously dropping as his vessels constricted and his organs began their desperate struggle for oxygenated blood. The cardiac monitor traced a pattern that made experienced nurses' faces go pale, an arrhythmia building toward the kind of catastrophic failure that could stop a young heart in seconds. Dr. Hale froze for one terrible moment, his face transforming from confident authority to dawning horror as his brain processed what his hands had just done, as the connection between cause and effect slammed into him with the force of physics made personal. His eyes went to the monitor, Then to the patient, then to the medication tray, where the syringe lay empty and damning, its label suddenly readable now that disaster had arrived to clarify what pride had obscured. Marla saw the realization hit him, saw his face go white beneath the surgical mask, saw his bulletproof composure crack like ice over deep water, and in that moment she felt no satisfaction or vindication. Only the cold terror of watching a child die because hierarchy had mattered more than truth. The trauma bay exploded into frantic action, staff members shouting orders and counter-orders, someone calling for the crash cart, someone else pushing emergency medications. But underneath all the movement was the terrible knowledge that they were now fighting against a mistake that could have been prevented, that should have been prevented, that would have been prevented if anyone had listened to the 29-year-old nurse whose authority existed only in her correctness. The crash cart arrived with a violent clatter of metal wheels on linoleum, pushed by a resident whose face had gone the color of old paper, his hands already reaching for the defibrillator paddles, before he even understood what had caused Daniel Mercer's sudden cardiovascular collapse. The trauma bay had transformed from controlled urgency to barely contained chaos, every second now measured in heartbeats that were coming too fast and too irregular, in blood pressure numbers that kept dropping despite the emergency medications being pushed through the IV lines with desperate speed. Marla moved on instinct rather than thought, her training taking over even as her mind reeled with the horror of watching her warning become prophecy. Her hands preparing medication reversals and checking equipment connections, while her eyes never left the monitor where Daniel's vital signs were painting a picture of a body at war with itself. The epinephrine overdose was flooding his system with 10 times the chemical intensity his young organs could handle, his heart trying to beat itself apart, his vessels clamping down so tightly that blood struggled to reach his brain and kidneys and liver, every cell screaming for oxygen that circulation could no longer deliver. Dr. Hale had recovered from his moment of paralysis, but the damage was already visible in his movements, the surgical precision replaced by something more frantic and less certain. His hands moving through emergency protocols, while his mind raced through the calculation of blame and consequence and career-ending mistakes. He barked orders for beta blockers to counteract the epinephrine, for vasodilators to force the constricted vessels open, for fluids to compensate for the blood pressure collapse. His voice carrying the edge of barely controlled panic that infected the entire team with the awareness that their legendary surgeon was flailing. Sweat appeared on his forehead despite the climate-controlled temperature, droplets forming along his hairline and sliding down his temples as he worked with increasingly desperate intensity to undo what he had done, to reverse the chemical cascade that his pride and dismissal had unleashed into an innocent body. Around him, the trauma team moved with practiced efficiency, but their eyes kept flickering to each other with silent questions, with the dawning realization that something had gone terribly wrong, that this was not the routine stabilization they had expected, but a life-threatening crisis of medicine turned weapon. Through the glass partition, the governor's face had transformed from worried father to something more primal and terrifying, his eyes wide with the kind of fear that came from watching your child die and being utterly powerless to prevent it. His hands pressed so hard against the window that his fingers had gone white at the tips. One of the state troopers had placed a steadying hand on his shoulder, but the governor did not seem to notice, his entire being focused on the tableau beyond the glass, where his son's body was surrounded by medical professionals fighting against time and chemistry and mistake. Marla caught a glimpse of his expression and felt something twist in her chest, a mother's empathy, even though she had no children, a human recognition of what it meant to watch your bloodline balanced on the edge of extinction. She forced her eyes back to her work, to the IV lines and medication calculations and monitor readings that demanded her full attention. But the image stayed burned in her peripheral vision, a reminder of what was at stake beyond protocols and hierarchies and professional egos. Daniel's oxygen saturation dropped to 82%, then 79%, the numbers falling like stones into dark water while the respiratory therapist manually bagged him with violent squeezes of the resuscitator, trying to force air into lungs that were struggling against the chemical storm in his bloodstream. His skin had taken on a bluish tint beneath the fluorescent lights, cyanosis creeping into his lips and fingernails, his body's desperate signal that tissues were being starved of the oxygen they needed to survive. The cardiac monitor showed runs of ventricular tachycardia, the heart's electrical system misfiring in patterns that could cascade into the kind of lethal rhythm that required defibrillation, that required the violent reset of electrical paddles pressed to chest, and the hope that the heart would restart in a normal pattern rather than flatline into silence. Dr. Hale's hands trembled now, subtle enough that most people would not notice, but visible to anyone who had worked with him before, who had seen his legendary steadiness and knew that this tremor represented the complete dissolution of the confidence that had defined his career. The smell in the trauma bay had changed, the antiseptic sharpness now mixed with sweat and fear, and the acrid tang of adrenaline that humans excrete when mortality becomes immediate rather than theoretical. Time had become elastic, seconds stretching into subjective hours, while the clock on the wall marked the passage of real minutes with its steady mechanical sweep, indifferent to the drama playing out beneath its face. Marla's training told her to document, to note the time of the injection and the onset of symptoms and the interventions attempted. But her hands were too busy with life-saving actions to stop for paperwork, her mind already composing the incident report she would have to file, the testimony she might have to give, the moment she would have to recount when she had warned and been dismissed and watched helplessly as consequence arrived with the inevitability of physics. She pushed another dose of Esmolol through the IV line, a beta blocker meant to slow the racing heart, her movements precise despite the chaos around her. Despite the knowledge that she was now part of cleaning up a disaster she had tried to prevent. The monitors began to respond to the interventions, the emergency medications finally gaining traction against the epinephrine overdose, the numbers starting to stabilize in small increments that felt like miracles in the moment, heart rate dropping from 190 to 170. Blood pressure ticking upward from catastrophically low to merely dangerously low, oxygen saturation climbing back above 85% as the respiratory support and vasodilators allowed blood to reach starving tissues again. Dr. Hale's shoulders sagged with relief so profound it looked like physical pain, his hands finally steadying as he realized that Daniel Mercer was going to survive this, that the young heart was tough enough to withstand the chemical assault and skilled enough emergency medicine to pull back from the edge of the precipice. But even as the immediate crisis passed, the trauma bay remained charged with a different kind of tension. The awareness that this near catastrophe had been preventable, that pride had nearly killed and only luck and fast intervention had prevented tragedy from becoming headline. Marla felt tears burning behind her eyes, but refused to let them fall, refused to show weakness in this moment when she needed to be strong, when she needed to document and report and ensure that this mistake became lesson rather than secret. The aftermath arrived with the hollow exhaustion that followed any crisis. The trauma bay slowly emptying as Daniel Mercer was stabilized enough to be transferred to the pediatric intensive care unit, where he would be monitored for the next 48 hours while the overdose cleared from his system and his organs recovered from their brush with shutdown. The governor had been escorted upstairs to be with his son, his face still carrying the ghost of terror even as relief began to seep in at the edges, his expensive suit wrinkled and rain-soaked, and no longer mattering because his child was alive, damaged but breathing, broken but salvageable. The state troopers had dispersed, The press liaison had made phone calls to prepare damage control statements, and the trauma bay was being cleaned with methodical efficiency by housekeeping staff who scrubbed blood and saline and the invisible residue of near death from surfaces that had witnessed too many versions of this same story. Marla sat at the nurse's station, filling out incident reports, with hands that had finally started to shake now that the adrenaline was wearing off, her mind replaying the sequence of events with the cruel clarity of hindsight that made every moment sharper and more terrible. Dr. Conrad Hale stood at the glass partition, staring into the now empty trauma bay with the expression of someone watching the ruins of their own mythology, his surgical mask pulled down around his neck, his perfect hair finally disheveled from hours of crisis management. He had not spoken since Daniel's transfer, had not issued any orders or made any statements, had simply stood there in silence while the implications of what had happened settled into his bones like radiation, invisible but poisonous. Marla could see him from her position at the nurse's station, could see the way his shoulders had lost their confident set, the way his hands kept clenching and unclenching as if trying to wash away guilt that had become permanent. She knew she should feel vindicated, should feel righteous anger at having been dismissed and ignored, but instead she felt only a sick exhaustion and a deep sadness for all the ways that systems designed to save lives could become machines for crushing the people who tried to speak truth within them. The hospital administration had already been notified, a process that began with hushed phone calls and escalated through the chain of command, until the chief medical officer and the hospital's legal team were aware that the governor's son had nearly perished from a preventable medical error during a high-profile trauma case. Marla knew what came next: the investigations and interviews, the review boards and quality assurance meetings, the careful passing of language to determine liability and responsibility and whether anyone's license would be suspended or revoked. She had her documentation completed with meticulous detail, had noted the exact time she had warned Dr. Hale about the dosage discrepancy, had recorded his dismissal and her compliance, had created a paper trail that would protect her even as it destroyed him. It gave her no pleasure, this evidence of her own correctness, because correctness without the power to act was just another form of failure, just another reminder that knowing the truth mattered less than being allowed to speak it. Dr. Hale finally moved from his position at the glass, walking toward the nurse's station with the heavy gait of someone who had aged a decade in a single shift, his face carrying lines that had not been visible hours earlier when he had swept into the trauma bay with his theatrical confidence and celebrated reputation. He stopped at the edge of Marla's workspace, his eyes unable to meet hers directly, his voice when he spoke carrying none of the icy authority that had characterized his earlier dismissal. He said her name just once, a question and an apology and a plea, all compressed into 3 syllables, and then he said words that would be recorded in multiple incident reports and reviewed by multiple committees and possibly used as evidence in multiple proceedings. "You were right. I should have listened." The admission hung between them like smoke, visible and choking, a confession that could not be taken back or softened or explained away with surgical precision and legendary reputation. Marla looked up at him and saw not the celebrated trauma surgeon or the TED Talk speaker, or the man whose confidence filled rooms, but simply a human being who had made a terrible mistake and would have to live with the knowledge of how close that mistake had come to destroying multiple lives. Daniel's through death, his own through guilt, her own through silenced complicity. She nodded, accepting his apology without absolving him, acknowledging his admission without granting forgiveness that was not hers to give. And then she went back to her documentation, because the work of nursing continued, regardless of drama or crisis or the collision of ego and reality. The incident reports would be filed, the investigation would proceed, And somewhere in the machinery of accountability, Dr. Conrad Hale would face consequences for believing that authority exempted him from the possibility of error, for dismissing the warning that could have prevented catastrophe. The storm outside had passed while they were fighting for Daniel's life, the rain tapering off to a drizzle that left the windows streaked and the parking lot puddled with water that reflected the sodium lights in orange pools. Marla finished her shift at 6 in the morning, 16 hours after it had begun. Her body exhausted, but her mind too wired for sleep, her uniform carrying the smells of antiseptic and fear and the particular staleness that came from recycled hospital air. She walked out to her car through the early dawn, the sky turning pale grey above the Austin skyline, and sat behind the wheel for 10 minutes before she could make herself turn the key and drive home. She thought about Daniel Mercer recovering upstairs, about his father keeping vigil, about the moment when hierarchy had mattered more than truth, and how many times that same moment played out in hospitals and boardrooms and government offices, and anywhere else that power accumulated and grew defensive of its own infallibility. The sun was rising over the city as she drove through empty streets, light breaking through the clouds in those horizontal rays that made everything look temporarily sacred. And Marla Reyes understood that she would remember this night for the rest of her nursing career, would carry it as both wound and armor, as proof that speaking truth mattered even when it was ignored, that being right without power was still better than being silent with complicity. She had done her job, had followed the protocols, had raised the alarm even when dismissed, and because of that, a 14-year-old boy was alive to complain about hospital food and worry about his history paper and eventually ask out the girl in his English class. Authority had failed, humility had arrived too late, and silence would have buried them all. But in the end, truth had survived the dismissal, and sometimes survival was the only victory that mattered in the space between hierarchy and catastrophe, between pride and collapse, between the warning and the reckoning that came after it was ignored.